The Cold War is a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States that has had a serious effect on the history of our time. A conflict that has separated the world into two armed camps. This conflict is first of all a product of ideological differences. It also stems from geography and from the At the end of World War II, much of Europe was in a state of economic and political collapse. States under Soviet control. And Winston Churchill had declared,
"From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent."
Russia claimed to attack from the West. The West, however, became alarmed at this increase in Soviet power, and its opposition to Soviet expansion convinced the Russians that their wartime partners were essentially hostile. Russia reacted by increasing her efforts to dominate Eastern Europe. The West, in turn, reacted to this by opposing the Soviets even more strongly. Differing ways of life also contributed to the growing mutual suspicion and distrust. Ever since the Russian Revolution of 19, opposing political, economic concepts have divided Russia and the United States. And after World War II, the actions and reactions of both countries served to increase international tensions.
The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today necessitates my appearance before a joint session of the Congress. The foreign policy and the national security of this country are involved. One aspect of the present situation concerns Greece and Turkey.
In 1947, the United States reacted strongly to Soviet pressure on the Balkans. And in the spring of that year, the Congress voted military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey when it appeared that the Balkans might come under Soviet domination. This legislation, known as the Truman Doctrine, marked the start of the United States policy of containment, a policy aimed at halting further Soviet expansion. About the same time, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a European recovery program for all of Europe, including the USSR. This program of economic aid became known as the Marshall Plan. When the Soviet Union announced its opposition to the Marshall Plan, the European recovery program was set up for Western Europe only. And for the next 4 years, American economic assistance flowed into non-communist Europe. Marshall Plan aid in the form of goods and dollars represented more than United States generosity and goodwill. It was an expression of the fact that the United States knew there could be no effective response to communism in Western Europe until its allies became economically stable. During this period, the Soviet Union used a variety of tactics to extend its hold and influence over Eastern Europe. In Prague in 1948, the Czech Communist Party took over the government in a bloodless revolution that shocked and startled the Western powers. It put Czechoslovakia completely in the Soviet orbit. But the real crux of the Cold War in Europe was Germany. A Germany divided between 4 occupying powers. Soviet policy was dictated by a fear of a strong and resurgent Germany. The Soviet Union wanted to make certain that Germany would never again be able to invade Russia. The United States, on the other hand, wanted Germany as a strong buffer against any further communist expansion westward. The result, complete disagreement on the future of the occupied country. The Western Allies, the US, Britain, France, began to deal with Germany independently of the Soviet Union and decided to set up an independent government for their 3 zones of occupation. Russia responded by trying to strengthen its hold over Berlin. Though Berlin was also divided between East and West and was under 4-power control, it lay deep in the Soviet zone. Western routes to the city were under Russian control. In June 1948, the Soviets established a blockade of the city. For almost a year, trains and trucks with supplies for West Berlin were prevented from entering East Germany and crossing the Russian zone of occupation. The West's answer to this Soviet blockade was to set up an airlift. Despite harassment by the Russians and periods of bad weather, a fleet of planes flying around the clock was able to supply the besieged city. The success of the airlift was an important political and psychological victory for the West. It not only forced the Russians to lift their blockade in May '49, it proved America's intention to remain in Berlin. '49 was also the year in which the western zones of Germany became the German Federal Republic. Soon afterwards, the Soviet Union sponsored a German government for their zone, and East Germany became the German Democratic Republic. It seemed that there was little possibility in the foreseeable future of working out a satisfactory arrangement between East and West in regard to Germany. In the same year, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, came into existence. NATO was designed to create a defensive military alliance to counteract any communist threat to Western Europe. By 1949, the United States had also established strategic air command bases around the perimeter of the Soviet Union. Russia was now within easy range of U.S. aircraft capable of carrying atomic bombs. The American atomic monopoly was an important factor in U.S. military planning. Until Russia developed atomic weapons of its own, the United States was able to use the bomb as a strong deterrent in any crisis. However, the great power of the atomic bomb led many people to consider ways of controlling this awesome force.
I wish to emphasize that from the very beginning of the development of atomic energy, this nation has been determined to do everything in its power to proceed toward a truly effective international system of control.
For over 3 years, the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission had tried to draft a plan that would be acceptable to both the United States and the Soviet Union. By May 1948, it had come to a complete deadlock. Many observers believed that mutual suspicion and distrust was making it impossible to overcome the legal and technical obstacles to a workable system of international control. In any case, the impasse continued until September 1949, when a new development drastically changed the Soviet-American stalemate.
Have you got any statement about President Truman's statement on the atomic bomb? Does Russia have the atomic bomb? Well, what's your reply to me?
If the announcement made by President Truman that the Soviet Union now has the atomic bomb is true, then item number 23 in the agenda of the present session of the Assembly will project itself as one of the most important questions that we will take up. The impasse that now exists regarding the international control of atomic energy must be broken, and the Assembly must face this question squarely for the sake of mankind and for the peace of the world.
Both the United States and the Soviet Union talked of their desire for peace, but both countries adopted policies which increased their fear of the other. While the United States policy of containment was proving effective in Europe, the communist challenge in Asia was growing stronger. By 1949, the communists were in full control of the mainland of China, and as the strength and influence of the Chinese communists increased, the focal point of the Cold War shifted to Asia, particularly to Korea. The Korean peninsula protrudes from the mainland of China, and at the end of the war with Japan, the United States had occupied the southern half, the Soviet Union the northern half of this former Japanese protectorate. The 38th parallel was the dividing line between North and South Korea. As with Germany, the former Allies disagreed over the unification of the country. But unlike Germany, the Cold War in Korea erupted into a hot war. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and launched an attack in force on South Korea. The U.S. immediately requested a meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Trygve Lie, the UN Secretary General, affirmed the right of the Security Council to handle the Korean question.
The present situation is a serious one and is a threat to international peace. The Security Council is, Mr. President, in my opinion, the competent organ to deal with it. I consider it the clear duty of the Security Council to take steps necessary to re-establish peace in that area.
Within hours after the invasion had started, the Council branded the North Koreans as aggressors. It demanded they withdraw north of the 38th parallel and that hostilities cease immediately. Since the Soviet Union was boycotting Security Council meetings at this time, the Russians were unable to veto the Council's action, and all UN members were asked to assist in the execution of the resolution. 2 days later, President Truman announced that the United States Air and Sea Forces would give cover and support to troops of the South Korean government, while the Security Council passed a U.S. resolution recommending armed assistance be given to the Republic of Korea. Three days after this, on June 30th, the President gave the order that sent American ground forces into battle and authorized the Air Force to bomb North Korean targets. Despite assistance from both the United States and the United Nations, South Korean resistance was rapidly collapsing. By the end of July, all of the United Nations forces were contained in a small area, and many feared the UN troops would be pushed into the sea. But a few months later, the situation began to change. In September, General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations forces, landed troops at Inchon behind the North Korean lines. Soon, the military tide was reversed. North Korean forces were pushed back rapidly. In October, UN troops crossed the 38th parallel as the North Korean retreat continued. The decision to have United Nations forces cross the 38th parallel and enter into North Korea had important political as well as military repercussions. The Chinese communists had warned they would interfere in the war if North Korea was invaded, but General MacArthur ignored that warning. He continued his drive northwards toward the Yalu River and the Manchurian border. By November, when General MacArthur launched his offensive to encircle the enemy in front of the Yalu River, there were already a considerable number of Chinese troops in battle. The Chinese forces were able to contain MacArthur's winter offensive. They also were responsible for driving United Nations forces back into South Korea. It was a serious military defeat for both the United Nations and the United States. After further fighting, the military situation eventually became stalemated, with the UN troops now back at the 38th parallel. As the stalemate continued, General MacArthur demanded a decisive military victory, while President Truman favored negotiations to end the war.
For these vital reasons, to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war.
This basic disagreement resulted in MacArthur's dismissal and the reaffirmation of the American tradition of ultimate civilian control over the military.
Now that the fighting has temporarily abated, the outstanding impression which emerges from the scene is the utter uselessness of the enormous sacrifice in life and limb which has resulted. And we stand today just where we stood before it all started.
This is a tragic day for America. We do not know where we're going in Korea. We do not know where we're going in China. MacArthur knows, and he's been fired.
The President's action shows that he is resolved to stay out of a terrible, all-out war in China, and I agree with him.
Armistice negotiations began in June 1951 and went on through a series of deadlocks while bloody fighting continued. It took over 2 years before a truce was signed on July 27, 1953. By then, the Russian dictator, Joseph Stalin, had died, and the United States had a new president, General Dwight Eisenhower.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We may not now relax our guard nor cease our quest. We and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments. And as we do so, we shall fervently strive to ensure that this armistice will, in fact, bring free peoples one step nearer to their goal of a world at peace.
By the time the Korean War ended, the threat of the hydrogen bomb had given even greater urgency to the search for world peace. Korea offered proof of how readily the Cold War could develop into a shooting war, and how a small nation could commit a major power to military action. In 1953, many issues divided the two worlds. Today, many of the same challenges continue to confront us. Patience, commitment to our ideals, and skillful negotiations may eventually help to resolve these challenges.